A few years ago, the deal seemed simple. Come to Britain, work hard, follow the rules, stay long enough, and eventually you could build a permanent life there. For hundreds of thousands of people, that wasn't just an immigration policy. It was a plan they built careers around, a plan they built families around, a plan they built their future around. But in 2026, that plan suddenly feels a lot less certain, because Britain is changing the rules. Not overnight. Not with one dramatic announcement, but through a series of reforms that are quietly reshaping who gets to stay, who gets to settle, and who may eventually decide that Britain is no longer worth the uncertainty. And here's the strange part. This isn't really a story about immigration. It's a story about what happens when a country needs migrants, while simultaneously trying to reduce migration. Because right now, Britain finds itself trapped between those two goals. It needs nurses. It needs care workers. It needs engineers. It needs international talent. Yet politically, there is growing pressure to bring immigration numbers down. And when those two forces collide, someone inevitably gets caught in the middle. Today, that someone is often the migrant who thought they had already done everything right. The skilled worker who followed every requirement. The student who planned to build a career after graduation. The family that expected permanent residency to be only a few years away. For many of them, the biggest fear is no longer rejection. It's uncertainty. Because uncertainty changes everything. It delays investments. It delays home purchases. It delays family decisions. And eventually, it makes people ask a question they never expected to ask. Should we build our future somewhere else? But to understand why this conversation is happening now, we need to go back for a moment. Not to 2026. Not even to 2025. We need to go back to a prediction that turned out to be completely wrong. When Britain voted to leave the European Union, many people expected immigration to fall dramatically. That seemed logical. After all, immigration had been one of the central issues during the Brexit debate. Control the borders. Reduce migration. Ease pressure on housing and public services. That was the promise many voters believed they were voting for. But reality had other plans. The people arriving changed. The system changed. The routes changed. Yet Britain continued attracting large numbers of workers, students, and migrants from around the world. In some ways, Britain became more globally connected than ever. Hospitals recruited overseas staff. Universities expanded their international student programs. Businesses searched globally for talent. Care providers increasingly depended on foreign workers to fill jobs that many employers struggled to fill locally. And for a while, the system kept moving. The economy got workers, universities got students, employers filled vacancies. Everyone seemed to benefit, at least on paper. Then, another problem started dominating the national conversation. Housing. Ask almost any young British family what worries them today. Housing will probably be near the top of the list. Buying a home has become harder. Renting has become more expensive. In some areas, affordability feels increasingly out of reach. Now, to be fair, immigration didn't create Britain's housing problems. Not even close. Years of underbuilding played a role. Planning restrictions played a role. Infrastructure challenges played a role. But politics rarely operates on simple explanations. And gradually, immigration became tied to the housing debate. Then it became tied to pressure on schools, pressure on healthcare, pressure on transportation. Whether those connections were entirely fair became almost irrelevant. Because once voters start connecting two issues together, politicians eventually respond. And that's exactly what happened. The political conversation shifted. The focus was no longer simply on who could enter Britain. The focus became something much bigger. How many people should ultimately be allowed to stay? That question is now driving almost every major immigration discussion in the country. And it leads directly to the issue making many migrants nervous today. Not visas, not border controls, not enforcement. Settlement. Because for years, many migrants believed they understood the path ahead. Now, that path looks much less predictable. And that's where the real story begins. For most people, permanent residency isn't exciting. It doesn't generate headlines. It doesn't dominate election campaigns. But for migrants, it can mean everything. Permanent residency is often the moment uncertainty finally ends. The moment someone stops thinking in terms of temporary visas and starts thinking in terms of long-term life decisions. Maybe it's time to buy a home. Maybe it's time to launch a business. Maybe it's finally time to stop worrying about renewal dates and immigration paperwork. For years, many migrants structured their lives around a fairly straightforward timeline. Work, stay compliant, meet the requirements, reach the finish line. Simple. Not easy, but simple. Now that timeline is becoming the subject of intense political debate. And that's creating a problem, because people can adapt to difficult rules. What they struggle with is changing rules, especially when those changes arrive halfway through the journey. Imagine running a marathon. You've already completed most of the race. Then someone tells you the finish line has moved. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but possibly soon. That's the feeling many migrants describe when discussing Britain's immigration future. No one knows exactly what the system will look like several years from now. No one knows how future governments may adjust the rules. And that uncertainty is beginning to influence decisions today. Some are delaying major purchases. Some are reconsidering long-term plans. Some are actively comparing Britain with other countries that appear more predictable. And that creates a challenge Britain didn't expect. Because attracting talent is one thing, keeping talent is something else entirely. And in 2026, keeping talent may be becoming harder, especially as another obstacle begins to reshape the immigration landscape. An obstacle measured by a single number. A number that can determine whether someone qualifies to stay. A number that employers, workers, and policymakers are all watching closely. Salary. And for many migrants, that number may soon become the difference between building a future in Britain and starting over somewhere else. The strange thing about immigration is that most people focus on borders. They focus on who gets in. Governments focus on something else. Who gets to stay. And in Britain, one of the biggest tools for controlling that outcome isn't a border fence. It's a salary requirement. On paper, that might sound reasonable. If a country is going to offer long-term opportunities to foreign workers, many voters believe those workers should be filling skilled positions and earning competitive wages. The logic is simple. Higher salaries often suggest higher demand skills. Higher demand skills are easier to justify politically. At least, that's the theory. In practice, things get far more complicated. Because not every important job comes with a high salary. And that's where Britain's immigration debate starts running into reality. Take the care sector. Britain's population is aging. Demand for care workers continues to grow. Employers across the country have repeatedly warned about staff shortages. Yet care work has traditionally been one of the lower-paid sectors in the economy. Now imagine you're running a care home. You already struggle to recruit enough staff. You already operate on thin margins. Then immigration rules become stricter. Finding workers becomes harder. Keeping workers becomes harder. And suddenly, the shortage becomes even more severe. This is the challenge Britain keeps running into. The country wants fewer migrants overall, but parts of the economy still depend heavily on migrant labor. Both statements can be true at the same time. And that's why immigration policy often creates unintended consequences. A rule designed to solve one problem can create another. Raise salary thresholds. You may reduce migration, but you may also reduce the number of workers entering sectors that already face shortages. Tighten visa requirements. You may satisfy political demands, but you may also make employers think twice before investing in overseas talent. That's why businesses across Britain have been paying very close attention to recent immigration changes. For them, this isn't an abstract political debate. It's a workforce issue, a recruitment issue, a growth issue, and increasingly, a competitiveness issue. Because talent has options. A software engineer doesn't just compare jobs. They compare countries. So does a nurse. So does a researcher. So does a skilled tradesperson. And when people start comparing countries, predictability becomes incredibly valuable. Sometimes more valuable than salary itself. because nobody wants to build a future on uncertain ground. Which brings us to a group that may be feeling that uncertainty more than anyone else: international students. For years, Britain was one of the most attractive study destinations in the world. The formula was easy to understand. Study at a respected university, gain international experience, build professional connections, potentially launch a career afterward. For many students, the degree was only part of the attraction. The opportunity that came after graduation mattered just as much. And that opportunity helped fuel a massive international education industry. Universities benefited. Local economies benefited. Students benefited. It seemed like a win for everyone involved. Until migration numbers became a political issue. Once that happened, international students found themselves caught in a debate they didn't create. Critics argued that some education routes were being used as backdoors into long-term migration. Supporters pushed back. They argued that international students bring billions into the economy. They support universities. They spend money locally. And many eventually become highly skilled workers. The debate continues today. But regardless of where someone stands politically, one thing is becoming clear. The experience of being an international student in Britain is changing. The assumptions people made 5 years ago are no longer guaranteed. And that uncertainty doesn't just affect students. It affects universities as well. Because international students aren't simply visitors. For many institutions, they represent a major source of revenue. A significant drop in overseas enrollment can create financial pressure almost immediately. Some universities have already warned about exactly that. Which creates another dilemma. Britain wants world-class universities. World-class universities attract international students. International students contribute to migration numbers. And suddenly the country finds itself balancing competing priorities once again. Economic needs, political realities, public expectations. No easy solution, no obvious winner. And that's exactly why immigration has become one of the most difficult policy challenges facing modern governments. But even that isn't the biggest change happening in Britain right now. Not even close. Because while politicians debate migration numbers, another transformation is happening quietly in the background. One that affects almost every migrant, regardless of income, profession, or nationality. The immigration system itself is becoming digital, completely digital. No physical card. No physical document. No physical proof sitting safely in a wallet. Just an online status linked to a government system. Supporters say it's the future. Faster, simpler, more efficient. Critics worry about something else. What happens when technology fails? What happens when records don't match? What happens when someone suddenly needs to prove their status and can't access it? For most people, those questions sound hypothetical. Until the day they aren't. And as Britain continues its transition toward a fully digital immigration system, millions of people are learning something important. The future of immigration isn't just about who enters a country or who stays. It's increasingly about who controls the data, who manages the systems, and who gets caught when those systems make mistakes. Because in the years ahead, immigration may become less about paperwork and more about algorithms. And that shift is creating an entirely new set of concerns. Concerns that could shape the next chapter of Britain's immigration story. But there's one group watching all of this especially closely. People who thought they were approaching the finish line. People who believed citizenship was only a matter of time. Because for them, the next set of changes may be the most important of all. If you've ever moved to another country, you'll understand something that immigration statistics never capture. The hardest part isn't arriving, it's committing. It's deciding that this isn't just a temporary stop, this is home. And that decision usually happens long before citizenship, long before permanent residency, long before the paperwork is complete. It happens when someone buys a house, starts a business, gets married, raises children, builds a life that would be painful to leave behind. That's why the next phase of Britain's immigration debate matters so much. Because it isn't simply changing policies, it's changing confidence. And confidence is surprisingly fragile. Once people begin questioning whether they have a long-term future somewhere, their behavior starts to change. Sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. A skilled worker may decide not to buy property. An entrepreneur may choose not to invest. A graduate may accept a job offer in another country, not because they were forced to leave, because they stopped feeling certain enough to stay. And that's where Britain may be facing a challenge that rarely appears in political speeches. Retention. Attracting talent is difficult. Keeping talent can be even harder, especially in a world where skilled workers have more choices than ever before. 20 years ago, opportunities were limited. Today, they're global. A software developer in London can consider opportunities in Canada, Australia, Singapore, the United States. The same is true for researchers, engineers, healthcare professionals, financial specialists. The competition isn't just between employers anymore. It's between countries. And countries are increasingly competing for the exact same people. That's why some economists believe the real question isn't whether Britain can reduce migration. Of course it can. The real question is whether Britain can reduce migration without reducing competitiveness. Because those are not necessarily the same thing. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than politics. On one side are voters concerned about housing, infrastructure, and public services. On the other side are businesses concerned about labor shortages and economic growth. Both groups have legitimate concerns. Both groups have valid arguments. And governments are stuck trying to satisfy both, which is often impossible. Take healthcare. Britain's National Health Service remains one of the country's most important institutions. Millions rely on it every year. But healthcare staffing has been a challenge for years. Recruitment remains difficult across multiple specialties. An aging population continues increasing demand. At the same time, healthcare systems around the world are competing for many of the same professionals. Nurses, doctors, specialists, care workers. Countries aren't just competing for resources anymore. They're competing for people. And people tend to move toward opportunity, toward stability, toward predictability. That's why immigration policy increasingly overlaps with economic policy, because every rule sends a signal, not just about who is welcome, but about how welcome they are. And signals matter, sometimes more than politicians realize. A country can remain open to immigration on paper, but if potential migrants perceive the future as uncertain, they may choose somewhere else anyway. That doesn't show up immediately. It doesn't create a headline the next morning. It's a slow process, a gradual shift, 1,000 individual decisions made by people weighing their options. And by the time governments notice the trend, it can be difficult to reverse. Because reputation takes years to build, and only a short time to change. That's one reason immigration experts have been watching Britain so closely. Not because Britain is unique, but because many developed countries are wrestling with the exact same dilemma. How do you maintain public confidence in immigration while still attracting the workers, students, and professionals your economy depends on? Nobody has fully solved that puzzle. Not Britain, not Canada, not Australia. Not anyone. But Britain may be becoming one of the most important test cases, because the country is attempting something very difficult: reducing migration while maintaining global competitiveness. And the outcome remains far from certain. In fact, some of the biggest consequences may not become visible for years. That's often how demographic and economic changes work. The effects arrive slowly, then all at once. But there's another reason this story matters. A reason that goes far beyond economics. Because behind every policy debate, behind every migration statistic, behind every political speech, there are real people trying to make life-changing decisions. People wondering where to raise their children. People wondering where to build careers. People wondering whether they belong. And for them, immigration policy isn't an abstract discussion. It's personal, deeply personal. A change that sounds small in Westminster can feel enormous to someone whose future depends on it. That's why so many migrants are paying attention right now. Not because they expect immediate disaster, not because they believe Britain is closing its doors, but because they understand something important. Major changes rarely happen all at once. They happen gradually. One adjustment, one policy revision, one new requirement, one political debate at a time. Then one day, people look back and realize the system has become something entirely different. And that may be exactly what Britain is experiencing right now. Not a sudden transformation, a gradual one. A slow redesign of how the country thinks about immigration, settlement, and long-term belonging. The question is whether that redesign will achieve its goals. Will it ease pressure on housing and public services? Will it restore public confidence? Will it create a system voters see as fair and sustainable? Or will it create new problems that policymakers aren't yet anticipating? At this point, nobody knows. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because we're not looking at the outcome, we're watching the experiment unfold in real time. An experiment with millions of lives, billions of pounds, and the future direction of one of the world's most influential countries at stake. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. Britain isn't really deciding whether immigration is good or bad. That debate is largely over. Most people accept that immigration will remain part of Britain's future. The real debate now is something much narrower and much harder. What kind of immigration? How much immigration? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to become British? The answer to that question will shape Britain's future for decades. Not just for migrants, but for everyone. So, are millions of people actually going to leave Britain? Probably not. At least not in the way many headlines suggest. There will be no single day when millions of migrants suddenly pack their bags and head for the airport. No dramatic exodus. No mass departure. Reality is usually less dramatic than a headline, and far more complicated. But that doesn't mean nothing is changing. In fact, something significant may already be happening. Because the most powerful immigration policies are often the ones that change behavior before they change numbers. Think about it this way. If someone believes they have a stable future in a country, they invest, they commit, they put down roots. If they become less certain, they hesitate. And when enough people begin hesitating at the same time, the effects can spread through an economy long before they appear in official statistics. That's why Britain's immigration reset matters. Not because it will remove millions of people overnight, but because it may influence the decisions of millions of people over time. Some may decide to stay, some may decide to leave, some may choose never to come in the first place. And all three outcomes matter, because immigration is ultimately about choices. The choice to arrive, the choice to remain, the choice to build a future. Britain is not eliminating those choices. It is redefining them. And that distinction is important. The country remains one of the world's largest economies, one of the world's leading financial centers, home to globally respected universities, home to major industries, home to opportunities that continue attracting people from every corner of the world. None of that disappears because immigration rules become stricter. But opportunity alone isn't always enough. People also look for certainty, predictability, a sense that if they follow the rules, the destination will remain visible. That's the real issue at the center of this debate. Not whether Britain needs migrants. It clearly does. Not whether migration should be controlled. Most voters agree it should. The challenge is finding the balance. And balance is where immigration debates become difficult. Reduce migration too aggressively, and employers may struggle. Maintain high migration, and public concerns may intensify. Move too slowly, and voters become frustrated. Move too quickly, and businesses become concerned. Every decision creates trade-offs. Every policy creates winners and losers. And that's why there are no easy answers, only competing priorities. What makes Britain especially interesting is that the country is attempting to solve this problem while much of the developed world faces similar pressures. Housing affordability, labor shortages, aging populations, political polarization, rising concerns about migration. These are not uniquely British challenges. They're appearing across Europe, across North America, across parts of Asia and Oceania. Which means Britain may be offering a glimpse into something bigger, A preview of how developed countries could approach immigration during the next decade. More selective, more controlled, more focused on long-term economic contribution, but potentially less predictable for the people trying to build lives within those systems. And that's why migrants are paying such close attention. Because today's debate isn't only about Britain, it's about the future direction of immigration policy across much of the developed world. The rules may differ, the details may vary, but the underlying question remains remarkably similar. How open should a country be, and who gets to stay? For now, Britain is still searching for its answer. The government believes these reforms will create a system that is fairer, more sustainable, and better aligned with public expectations. Critics worry that the country could become less attractive to the very people it still needs. Both sides believe they're protecting Britain's future, and both sides may be partially right. Which brings us back to the people at the center of this story. The workers, the students, the families, the entrepreneurs, the people who arrived believing they understood the path ahead. For them, the biggest change may not be a specific visa rule, or a salary threshold, or a new digital system. It may simply be the realization that the future is no longer as predictable as it once seemed. And sometimes, uncertainty can be more powerful than any policy. Because uncertainty changes plans, it changes decisions, and occasionally, it changes lives. So while millions are unlikely to be forced out of Britain, millions may find themselves asking a question they never expected to ask. Is this still the place where I want to build my future? And in the years ahead, the answer to that question could shape Britain's future just as much as any immigration law ever will. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.